This episode is going to ruffle some feathers, undoubtedly. Consider what our values of American patriotism are. And I mean our actual values of patriotism, not the fake-triot alt-right male militia stereotype. If you're in America, you must have some sense or value of where you are and what that represents or stands for. Positive or negative, there is a feeling about patriotism. By definition, it's simply the commitment and strong devotion to a country with a vigorous support for that country. Waving a flag isn't patriotism, that's performative. Patriotism isn't an action. Patriotism is a value that goes beyond who you vote for, which party you support, or how you decorate your car, house, or baby. Patriotism goes beyond cult of personality and is almost as a foundational value as one's spirituality. However, in recent years, our patriotism has been intertwined with our spirituality in unhealthy and inappropriate ways. In fact, that's when patriotism devolves to nationalism, the predecessor of fascism. That is the slippery slope of post-World War II American propaganda. United we stand, divided we fall. That was the story of America's slow slide into a new narrative of narcissism and stoking an unstable societal sociopathy. What happened was we had leaders who were more interested in their own ambitions than creating the true vision of America's founding fathers. Or at least the vision they said they had. The 20th century's division over, again, states' rights on who they could consider human would bring about a radicalized movement in the mid-20th century Republican Party that would use our foundational values to drive wedges between us, to keep us fighting, while our prosperity and any hope of generational wealth was sold off to the highest bidder, which was usually them. America's collective personality shifted during the mid to late 20th century regarding patriotism and how that was used to manipulate the masses by misinterpreting our foundational rights and misleading so many with military mind games and gun-loving gaslighting. We were brainwashed by broadcast, backing the blue every Monday night in primetime. In this episode, I'm discussing one of our foundational rights in America, in particular, one of our most misinterpreted, misunderstood, and misapplied rights. I'll discuss how we should view this more as a privilege and not for the privileged. I'm discussing the Second Amendment in more detail, how it's evolved, how it's altered America. You'll find out more about the NRA's history and how it was taken over in what amounts to an organizational insurrection to push an agenda of murder for profit with no accountability, injustice, or mental health. We hear about how it isn't a gun crisis in America, it's a mental health crisis. Well, both things can be true. Beware of someone who fails to recognize nuance. The love of guns is the mental health crisis, America. It's the selling of one's soul and succumbing to scare tactics that sends one straight to... Well, I can't say that, can I? First off, I don't believe in hell. Second, as we've learned this season, the blasphemy of all blasphemy, the greatest sin of the tongue, is you, mere mortal, telling another person they'll go to hell. That's taking the Lord's name in vain. According to theological definitions, experts and all. But who cares about any of that silliness when we just want more and more and more guns and bigger and faster firing firearms? We want them tattooed on us. We want them on our shirts, our hats, and even on our cars. We want them everywhere, and we want you to know we got them. Yet, no one seems bothered by that. Why? Why? Let's discuss. Let's discuss how even the act of killing someone with a gun is so ingrained in American evangelical culture when it is contradictory to everything their doctrine espouses. If I sound biased or anti-gun, I am. It's just a well-informed academic and experiential bias. What I'll discuss isn't something I just whipped up on a whim. These are long and drawn-out considerations over decades. In 2022, I was asked to speak before Capitol Hill as part of a filibuster on gun reform. I was asked to share my story because mine is a unique perspective on this subject. Not only do I analyze that culture in most of the content I create, it's a part of my history. Raised by a proud patriot gun nut amophile father, I had a gun in my hand from a very early age. I was trained for something. I couldn't tell you. It seemed like, anyway. My father is what I've come to consider and discover your typical run-of-the-mill, rural, responsible gun lover. I have found that many of the most alarming qualities regarding my father and his attitude toward guns were reflective of so many people I would meet throughout my life who would tout themselves as responsible gun owners. It's much deeper than we might think. I've studied quite a bit on it and have come to some revelations. Without spoiling all of it, when it comes to 2A in this country, it's that Inigo Montoya effect. That word doesn't mean what you think it means. Our rights only matter when we are the United States of America. And our rights only matter when everyone's rights matter. In this episode, I will deliver that speech I gave before Capitol Hill with a director's cut, and we'll understand a little better what we're facing should this country truly divide. And welcome to the podcast. Growing up, I had a disturbing connection to firearms. Granted, I'm not so sure it was unusual or out of the ordinary for my small rural southern town. It isn't that my experience is so bizarre, really. It's just that my experience is bizarre, but it's completely normal. My father wasn't going to leave me defenseless in this world. He almost seemed disappointed I rejected the idea of killing. I wasn't into hunting, not like other boys in my culture. I loved animals. I connected with nature, too much, almost empathic. So I would make jokes and disgusting comments about harming an animal in some way. Mowing down a deer or something, I don't know. I just know that my talk about it was reactionary at the shock to my core over actually causing any kind of harm to a defenseless creature. I was building a wall around myself, desensitizing myself to the horrors of reality. Maybe I didn't recognize it at the time. It seemed animals were a touchy subject for most people, and when I made jokes, tiptoeing toward the not-so-tasteful, it made them uncomfortable. Call me an energy vampire, but by God, I love making people uncomfortable. You see, I had a lot of very not normalized way too early. Maybe it was early on in my childhood. I had an older cousin who had some mental issues, and there were tales he strangled a dog to death. I think I realized the power in myself as a human that I could very easily end something's life. My father kept reminding me of that with a gun in my hand, so it wasn't a far stretch to consider what I could do without one. When I was a kid, I hated bugs almost as much as I do now. I would burn anthills, pour gasoline into the anthill, strike a match, watch it burn. Yet no one stopped me from killing ants because, why? They're ants? It's okay because they're insects? I hated ants. Ants were always everywhere. No, I was only admonished for it when I tried to pour gasoline over the open flame to keep it going. I was a kid, y'all, not even a teenager. My dad didn't take notice until I almost made myself a Molotov cocktail. Still, not a lot of worry that I'm outside, unsupervised, murdering all these, yes, bugs, but still. I've been hunting. I can shoot, probably. It's like riding a bike. It might take me a few shots to get the feel back if I ever wanted to, but I could. My dad always hailed my natural skills with firearms. My brother was decent, but Daddy always told the tale of Robbie trying to shoot a shotgun and nearly dislocating his shoulder. I remember a time, I can't remember how old, or where we were living at the time. Daddy took me up on the mountain. We took out some bottles and cans. I impressed him. I always wanted to do that. I just wanted his approval from being me, not for being a good shot. My dad did approve of me for the most part, to be fair. I simply wouldn't play along with Dad's gun games. It wasn't that I didn't have skill, it's just that I never liked that skill. What good was target practice? What targets are we practicing for? I'm not hunting, and if I'm in a Walking Dead world with limited ammo and an apocalyptic breakdown, I'm not so sure the deep thinkers are the first to survive what comes after. My dad wasn't a hunter. He hunted. Rather, he killed for sport. He ate the meat sometimes, when it was an edible critter like a deer. Dad just seemed to like shooting things. With one eye, he was probably a better shot than most men with two. Never having to squint and all. My father posed the topic of guns to me as preparation for the coming fall. Not deer season or turkey or whatever is in autumn. The revolution, the fall of America, he was convinced would come within my lifetime. What could I say? Eddie was a prophet. Or a paranoid delusional narcissist trapped in a perspective prison of his own unresolved trauma. My father was a learned man when it came to history. The context of what he learned is important, and to that I've limited knowledge. I know he did not like the Confederacy and taught me about the sovereign state of Franklin, which we'll discuss soon. My father was a racist, but he didn't speak kindly toward the Klan. My dad wasn't a joiner of things until church. He could have been a Freemason like his father. He didn't want to follow in anyone's footsteps. He could have joined a lot of groups, I feel like, had he wanted to. He certainly had the attitude of some of them. I think about these groups that exist today, the ones that stormed the Capitol on January 6th and have gone on to be allowed to exist since, terrorizing communities across the country. I wonder which one my dad would most likely identify with. Maybe not the current "don't tread on me" ideology, which embraces the cultism of a flag and the treasonous message of a current adaptation of that flag means. My father wouldn't support turning against the United States of America. That's what the Gadsden flag stands for today. And those who embrace it also embrace their 2A rights and freedoms without any historical context. These groups, like the Three Percenters, Patriot anything in the name, Liberty anything, so many of these groups are pushing a dangerous nationalist us versus them agenda, provoking a civil war. Now, my father wouldn't have been for that. But my father would have been drawn in by Donald Trump. Now, I would hope he wouldn't, but the outward misogyny, racism, xenophobia, homophobia, those are all traits my father enjoyed, like an aged cheese. I don't know if my father would have succumbed to the cultism of Cult 45, traveling to D.C. to protest, then getting swept up in the rush and entering the Capitol, if he were alive and healthy enough to do that. Could my father have fallen for the propaganda and divisive rhetoric of the alt-right? What does it matter? He's been ashes since 2007. It's context for what's next. My speech before Capitol Hill in Washington, D.C. from 2022. What I learned throughout my life is that the love of guns is a dangerous characteristic in a human being. It's a big red flag. It's sociopathic and opens one up to devaluing human life, which slowly erodes to devaluing a human's existence. What does it matter? Who cares about me, much less my father, who's been dead since 2007? It matters because my father was the stereotypical epitome of your rural, proud, patriotic, American, responsible gun owner. He certainly was rural. He was a citizen of this country. He was very patriotic. He was proud. And he was a gun owner. He was not responsible. Not with his words, not with his mind, not with his health, not with his money, not with his mental health, not with his life, not with his children, not with his wife, not with his business, not with his cars, not with his own body. Hell, he blew his own eye out at 14. My father was certainly not responsible with guns. But make no mistake, regardless of where he would have been January 6th, 2021, or where he would have stood on that, my father, for every bit of my life that I knew him, was a radicalized extremist who groomed me, indoctrinated me, gaslit me, abused me, manipulated me, and trained me to be Well, my father trained me to be a killer. And that's all you're getting of that. Hello, and thank you for the opportunity to speak today. Thank you even more for hearing me, and my most sincerest thanks for those considering these words, which are important to me and so many millions of Americans who are insisting on a safer existence for our children. My experience with gun violence is as lengthy and vast as my experience with mental health. My father, Eddie Brandon, was, among other things, a proud American patriot, a Second Amendment advocate, and what I hear far too often, a responsible gun owner. He was also an abusive, bigoted, sociopathic narcissist, an extremist who was somehow radicalized in his political and social views. I was raised around guns my entire childhood into young adulthood. The issues I'm about to express today are not unresolved daddy issues, but resolved deconstruction through years of therapy, earnest reflection, education, and self-awareness. You see, I grew up to be a proud American patriot too, just a different brand of American patriot than some of you might be used to. Someone who studied Madison and the Second Amendment to understand what its original intent was and how it's being bastardized for the sake of profit and political posturing. And I've also grown up around those responsible gun owners. I'd like to give you the spoilers of this speech up front. My father, who I'm about to introduce you to, by my vast and first-hand experience, is the rule and not the exception to it when it comes to those who speak openly, loudly, and proudly about being responsible gun owners. Before I was the host of Overthinking Everything, an author, an actor, voiceover artist, and social media activist, I was a radio programmer and personality for the better part of 2 decades, mostly in the country music format, and then working in automotive sales in small rural areas in Tennessee. I've witnessed gun deals and exchanges happening in broad daylight in parking lots of radio stations and car dealerships. Some legal, some not. Every one of them disturbing. I have literal hundreds of examples similar to these few experiences which I'm about to detail for you. Let me tell you about my dad. My father was born in 1942 in a small rural Tennessee town. My father, politically, I'm not sure what to call him other than a radicalized extremist. My father, like many of yours, was from a different time. Maybe it's unfair to judge him on modern standards. Still, my father's temper, anger issues, abusiveness, narcissism, and hatred for others shouldn't be glossed over. My father would do everything he could to help his fellow man, even if those were men he looked down on because of the color of their skin, who they had sex with, or where they were from. A walking contradiction. Maybe you can relate. In 1956, when my father was 14, he lost his right eye in an incident involving a firecracker. My father had traded a neighborhood boy the opportunity to use the lawnmower, one of those old rotary blade push kind without a motor, as primitive as can be. Daddy took his new firecracker, went to the shed, found a glass bottle, and said, "Hold my Ovaltine and watch this." What he watched was a shard of glass puncture his right eye, which hospitalized him, cost him his vision, and condemned my father to a glass eye throughout his formative high school years. My father was restricted from contact sports, the military, and countless other opportunities to showcase his toxic masculinity. My dad wasn't talented in other ways. He wasn't going to do band. He might have done theater in a different place. Being excluded from the Boys Will Be Boys Club of extracurriculars and the machismo life paths almost assuredly affected his social standing. As a result, my grandparents, Helen and Joe Brandon, became activists, fighting for laws, regulations, and policies to be in place regarding fireworks. I have old newspaper articles about their fight to ban fireworks, which clearly didn't work. Still, reforms were made to make people safer, despite some of the same oppositional outcry we hear today. My grandparents fought so that other kids wouldn't have access to something that would cost them so much. Granted, not covered by our Bill of Rights, but a problem was found the hard way, and people sought resolutions to spare others suffering. Over fireworks. I mean, let's forget they were the kids' parents, right? So why is their 14-year-old running around unsupervised in the first place? Different time, huh? I'm running out of time, so I want to tell you that the stories and examples I'm about to rush through have so much more detail and nuance to them that I could filibuster for 3 days consecutively. My father raised me with the ideal of, if you ever pull a gun on somebody, better be ready to kill them. Thanks to that, from about the age of 10, I've been ready to take a human life. Unfortunately, the gravity of taking a human life was not taught to me, just that if I aimed, I better aim for the head. My father wasn't much of a hunter for most of my life. Still, he owned an arsenal of firearms of all kinds, even illegal ones. One day, son, maybe not in my lifetime, but definitely in yours, you're going to see a revolution in this country, he would tell me. I would shake my head and make jokes about which care facility I would send him to. January 6, 2021, as I watched in abject horror, the very hill I speak to today was invaded in an insurrection, an attempted coup of our government, with sociopathic radicalized extremists, just like my father, seeking to hang the vice president for not breaking the law and overturning a free and fair election. With little doubt in my mind, were my father alive, he might have been at that insurrection. I assure you, father or not, I would still wish him to spend the rest of his life in a cell for the protection of all, and the fact that America isn't doing that today to those insurrectionists will be something we regret. If you don't think that's tied to gun violence, ladies and gentlemen, you're naive. The many statements that were recorded on audio, video, and many that weren't were speaking about how they wished they had brought more guns to the insurrection. I've heard this kind of talk my entire life. My father, the responsible gun owner, taught me everything about guns except how to properly store a weapon. My father never believed in gun safes and barely believed in locking his doors. My father rarely locked his car or truck where he kept a pistol with ammo under the seat. My father's arsenal, instead, was in his closet, leaned into a corner, dozens of rifles and more. The smaller guns in cases or drawers, or as was the norm for the .357 Magnum on top of the bookshelf by the front door. Ain't no warning shots with my dad. My father, the responsible gun owner in the months before his death in 2007, would have his unlocked home broken into and his arsenal of firearms and ammunition stolen. I say this in testimony before Capitol Hill because I believe with 99.9% certainty that my father orchestrated that, to sell them, to keep me from destroying them, or to put them in someone's hands who would use them. I want to tell you about the time I almost shot my dad with the gun from the bookshelf because I hadn't seen him in a while and he lost so much weight I thought he was a burglar. Or the time I pulled the gun on a door-to-door preacher for waking me up at 9 a.m. on a Saturday. The cops just came and laughed about it with me and Dad. Don't do that again. My father, the responsible gun owner, would often set up a makeshift deer blind outside his bedroom window, or inside his bedroom window, to pick off deer in the backyard and the woods beyond. We lived in a subdivision in town. The elementary school was behind our home, just over the hill through the woods. This is no surprise since my father would think nothing of stepping off the front porch to pick off squirrels from the power lines in a subdivision. When I was in high school, one of my neighbor's dogs would come into our basement. Dad worked from home and often left the garage door open. The dog would come in and defecate on the floor, and I was the one that had to clean it up. I complained about this because I couldn't have a dog because of the mess, and I was cleaning up a dog's mess that wasn't mine. Dad told me he'd take care of it, just let him know the next time I saw the dog in the basement. Now, we knew the dog belonged to someone a house or two down, so me and Dad went down to ask them to please keep their dog out of our yard. They insisted it wasn't their dog, that their dog's an inside dog and only goes outside on a leash. To be fair, the guy was a real jerk about it. One day, not too long after, I started down the stairs to the basement and saw the dog about to pop a squat when I called for my dad. In a surreal moment I could only watch unfold in slow motion, my father opened the door to the basement, walked halfway down the stairs, 3 steps above me, with his .22 rifle in hand, aimed it with his good eye, and pop, 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 pop. The first shot I saw, the hole pierced the side of the small brown wiener dog. The dog was as big as my thigh, and my dad shot it twice. The second hole oozed a rapidly swelling pool of blood on the floor. The dog fell into that pool with what I could only guess was a crying whimper. It took me many years to come to terms with the next 4 shots my dad fired into that dog's carcass. Its black collar soaked, its name tag soaked. I lack the memory of the sounds of the dog, something I'm grateful for my mind or the gun for blocking out. My dad, like nothing happened, told me to get 2 hefty bags and dispose of the body. I had to pick up that dog by the tail and put it into the bag and carry that bag into the woods behind our house with fears of tears that would cause either ridicule or a beating. I guess it's better than him handing me a hacksaw. My brother, Robert Brandon, his adopted first son, never lived up to Dad's expectations of masculinity, and Robbie paid for it. Robbie had a lazy eye as a small child, and I think that sort of triggered my dad because of his glass eye to toughen Robbie up so he could handle being bullied. Robbie wasn't made of that stuff, though. My father robbed my brother of the emotional strength needed to get through the darkest times life throws at us. Then my father, the responsible gun owner, would exhibit the same kind of negligence any gun owner should be above. In 1999, my brother went through a dark, deep, depressive episode. Momentary problems, but his mental health, due in large part to a toxic and abusive nature of our childhood, would prompt him to make a permanent mistake, one he would pay for with his life, and one for which we would pay for the rest of ours. This is also my statement to federally decriminalize and legalize cannabis. It could have and would have saved my brother's life. My brother was dumped off on my dad's front step by his partner and the mother of his children. He had with him a small duffel bag with some of his prized possessions, trinkets, special items. After discovering her infidelity and falling into a deep depression, he lost his job, alienated those closest to him, distanced himself from the rest, and I guess he was just too much for her. He was gaunt and clearly unhealthy, physically and mentally. He probably should have gone straight to an inpatient facility, if I'm being honest. Hindsight, as my daddy would say, is 50-50. But this isn't about my brother. This is about my father, the responsible gun owner. The next morning, Dad, the responsible gun owner, thought it would be a great idea to take Robbie up on the mountain shooting, to cheer him up and blow off some steam, something we did a lot as kids. When they got home, Dad, the responsible gun owner, put the .357 Magnum back on top of the bookshelf, like always, loaded with hollow points. Even after the preacher woke me up, even after I almost mistook Dad for a burglar, hollow points. Because there ain't no warning shots with Daddy. Then my dad, the responsible gun owner, went to the basement to make some business calls in his office, leaving me stunned by his next action. He left my clearly very depressed brother alone, and my brother only got more and more depressed. After a while, Robbie got up, walked to the bookshelf, took that .357 Magnum loaded with hollow point bullets, and walked outside. Pacing around the house until he got to the side of it, he made his peace, and he turned the gun on his own temple. My brother's brilliant mind, that brain that could understand astrophysics, mechanical engineering, and complex scientific theories without any formal education, was splattered across the side of my father's house, with all of us literally and figuratively left picking up the pieces. When someone takes their own life, even if they leave a note or tell you why, you never understand why. Robbie was a victim of trauma. I realize that now. My brother, like I, suffered a lot of emotional, physical, and mental abuse from my dad, who was a victim of his own unresolved traumas, punishing everyone in his path because of it. My father was loving and worked hard to provide for us, but he also hit us, called us names, and verbally eviscerated us all. I struggled with suicidal thoughts most of my early life and attempted suicide so many times I wrote and produced a song about it. These themes are so prevalent in my life. They are the foundation of my podcast and the bulk of my social media content, my books, and the other content I create. I've spent years breaking down my father as a psychological case study, even though I'm no psychologist, as a means to understand and deconstruct some of the toxic, sexist, racist, bigoted, and radical ideals he imposed upon me. His attitude on guns and human life were at the foundation of these ideals. How he was radicalized, by what, by whom, I don't know. I just know my father spoke just like I hear so many comment on my podcast, TikTok, YouTube, and in real life too. So many comments from proud, responsible gun owners, just like my dad. The fact is, a responsible gun owner will never let you know they have one. And those who do, who boast and make it their personality, need to be seen for the small-minded cultists and sociopaths they are, and be treated for such conditions before being evaluated to see if they can be trusted with a gun. This isn't a speech to generalize every gun owner in America as a sociopathic, radicalized extremist like my father was, but to say that America does very little to combat sociopathic, radicalized extremists in our midst. America even elects some of them to office, I'm afraid. We have no choice in this country but to enact sweeping and drastic legislation that will take courage to pass. It will take patience to convince we, the people, that it is in our own best interests to save lives. And we must recognize that when others begin to make excuses as to why we shouldn't do whatever is necessary to stop another mass shooting, another school shooting, another suicide, we need to see these proud, responsible gun owners for what they are. Because the lack of empathy and compassion has a psychological diagnosis that we cannot and should not ignore. Nor should we have a system that enables that person to ever aim a gun at someone, much less to teach a child how to. Empathy and compassion are the traits you need in someone in order to trust them to wield a weapon with that kind of destructive force, to recognize the gravity of it all. We used to say, put those people on the front lines as infantry or cops. They'll make the hard calls when someone with a soul might have to pause and consider their actions. Today we see the cost of having those people in those positions. Those people kneel on a man's neck for 9 minutes. You see, a sociopath doesn't need a gun to kill. He just needs power. And we can do something to take some of that power away and make it harder to obtain for those who have those traits that I've been speaking about. This issue isn't even about my father, the responsible gun owner. Yet my father encapsulates the issue quite well. My father is representative of a crisis America is facing and has since the 1970s, 1977 specifically, when the National Rifle Association was taken over by radicalized extremists. My father's issue wasn't guns. Guns just made my father's narcissism and sociopathic disconnect from his humanity far more volatile and dangerous. Guns enabled him to hide behind firearms with the threat of a murder as a coward, so he wouldn't have to be brave and go to therapy to address his issues. This isn't a gun issue in America. This is a mental health issue. Isn't that what we always hear? Well, it's actually right. The gun is just a paperweight sitting on a desk by itself, even if it's loaded. It's only dangerous when someone touches it. This issue isn't a gun issue in America. This is a mental health issue. The love of guns is the mental illness. The ignorance on our history, context, nuance, and the Constitution is the mental illness. The sociopathic disconnect from empathy, compassion, and humanity is the mental health crisis in the United States of America. That's why the issue of gun violence, gun safety, gun regulations, and the complete and total eradication of the NRA is essential. We must fix the mental health problem in our society before we can allow the Wild West cowboy culture some Americans seem to want. Ladies and gentlemen, Republicans too, we have an opportunity to take a stand before the entire world, because they are watching what we do on this subject. They want us to take human life seriously for once. They also want us to take up all the guns. We must recognize the complexities of the issue of guns or mental health. So we must act responsibly, reasonably, pragmatically, and with purpose to make America safe again. Are we ready to? Are you ready to? Do you have the courage to act? I promise you, if I had the courage not to blow my brains out as badly as I wanted to for most of my childhood, knowing the guns were just in the closet with the ammo, if I had the courage to survive losing my brother, if I had the courage to survive living with my father, ladies and gentlemen, Republicans too, you can pull up your bootstraps and you can have the courage to save human lives. Regardless of our feelings on guns, the facts around guns, gun rights and gun violence speak for themselves. With great power comes great responsibility. And with much of the rhetoric and discussion about guns in America, I just don't hear a lot of responsibility. I hear some disturbing near threats. Try to take my guns, by God, no. Said so casually we completely forget and ignore the ... What kind of person ... Pull into my driveway and I'll ... Step into their yard, you won't make it out alive. If you tread on their small minds, you'll be terrorized. They pretend to praise their guns, their God, and their pride, while the NRA, their preachers, and their leaders lie. That's a lyric from my single Small Town, which is available now on iTunes. I wrote that song, those lines, because that's precisely how it seems with many of those outspoken, loud and proud, responsible gun owners. Seems it's how they feel about human life. It's an attitude in America that's been carefully crafted and curated and molded for as long as I've been alive. In fact, the year before I was born, this time, a cataclysmic cultural shift took place in this country that would define our path leading us to where we are today, a nation where even the most compassionate and empathetic leftist in America also loves their guns. Where someone who professes to follow the teachings of spiritual icons who preached peace and unity openly and proudly advertises for all to see that they'll shoot you if you give them the chance. The chance. The opportunity. Humans are animals. Stoking a bloodlust is a dangerous marketing strategy. Socially, I mean. It was great for business, just not for us. The year was 1977. As I mentioned in my speech in previous episodes, America was a different nation back then. Take a look back at the black and white of Back the Blue, that series where I discussed the Andy Griffith Show's presentation of firearms. In one of the first episodes, Sheriff Andy Taylor's son, Opie, accidentally slingshots a mama bird. And the lesson of the story is the consequences of being careless with dangerous things. Opie had to raise those birds till they could fly. Andy was the law in the town of Mayberry. Yet the head of the police department refused to strap iron because he didn't want the people in town to be afraid of him. He wasn't there for fear. He was there to protect and serve. You only need a gun to do one of those tasks. You don't always need a gun for that. Barney, though. Barney Fife was like my dad, the responsible gun owner. Half-cocked, impulsive, and outspoken on his opinions before he had taken the time to fully consider them. Look how much Barney apologized and ate crow in that show. Barney didn't make great choices, with much of anything, much less guns. So they let him carry a gun with one condition. He had to keep his bullet, the only one he was allowed, in his front breast pocket. He was the police. America laughed, but that's mostly because it was on a laugh track, And the idea of guns in the 1960s wasn't what it was in the 1980s, much less today. That's because the NRA I grew up with is a very different organization than the one of my father's generation. Things change. Organizations evolve. This isn't new. However, there is an issue when the principles of an entity shift, and they don't announce that change appropriately to its members or the public. In the case of the National Rifle Association, I can explain this best by hearkening back to the topic of professional wrestling's principle of kayfabe. I've discussed this previously, this secret rule of not letting the audience in on the joke. The NRA's internal shift from a mostly educational and pro-gun control organization to a for-profit lobbying powerhouse hell-bent on getting an AR in every white hand in America could be blamed on the fact that many of the generation just prior to my own grew up with the NRA being a noble, values-driven organization who not only understood the Second Amendment of the Constitution, but also understood and accepted the inherent dangers of firearms by themselves, and moreover, the danger of firearms in the hands of the wrong people. These people, based on close to 3/4 of a century's worth of branding, reputation, and success, took for granted that when they heard the NRA, it was something they could trust. Maybe they didn't know what was happening because they simply weren't as aware of the NRA the way we are today. It wasn't like it is now. It's entirely possible that for most Americans without the internet, the NRA was like Mothers Against Drunk Driving, PETA, the Humane Society, or like the National Highway Safety, whatever makes us all wear seatbelts. In their minds, maybe they didn't know what the NRA was because the NRA was like the group that sent out those gun safety flyers and did the school safety films on stuff like, "You'll shoot your eye out, kid." In fact, until 1977, this was the case for America's relationship with the National Rifle Association. The NRA began as a way to educate we the people on firearms and firearms safety. The idea behind the NRA was to lobby Washington on behalf of the American people for gun control, for gun safety, for sensible gun legislation. The NRA before the 70s fought for many of the restrictions and regulations that the current NRA rails against and seeks to unwind, and has in many cases. Within half a century, Americans, our society, and our culture have been influenced by the NRA's influence on Washington, Hollywood, big media, big entertainment, big whatever the hell you want to toss in here. Tell me something gun culture doesn't impact. Follow the money, and you'll see. What I'm spelling out for you is that in 1962, I'm not so sure you saw many people cruising around in their trucks with gun stickers all over the bumper. Then again, it wasn't out of the ordinary to see that truck with a rifle rack in the back window. We hear so much propaganda and misinformation comparing the periods of history in this country. And many will argue that the days of old when people just had gun racks in the back of their vehicles was the optimal societal norm, because then everyone was safe. But they weren't. How many of those trucks with gun racks stopped to defend an African American getting attacked by dogs or hoses in the 1960s South? How many of those responsible gun owners rolled up with their gun racks to defend innocent people from being told they couldn't drink from a water fountain or use the bathroom? How many of those good, patriotic Americans brandished those gun racks as a warning to those who harassed, threatened, and assaulted anti-war protesters? I'm not suggesting violence. I loathe it. I especially abhor gun violence. That is what this episode is about. But from the perspective of the responsible gun owner who has no problem murdering someone who pulls into their driveway to turn around or crossing state lines to hunt humans in a protest gone riot, the ideas I just presented shouldn't be out of the realm of acceptability if someone had actual values. For those who storm capitals, of course, I mean. For those boys proudly keeping their oath to stand against drag shows, where are those same values? That outrage over war and workers' rights, income inequality, racial, societal, or class equity, school shootings, pedophiles. Aren't they the ones accusing everything left of sociopath of grooming children? Yet we have a published list of an online database with names, convictions, and addresses. Where are those heroes? Where are they? Where was Westboro Baptist Church, Patriot Church, any of these cults of radicalized white nationalist Nazi extremists in any other issues? Why does it seem they only seek to oppress, well, let's say vulnerable minorities? Vulnerable minorities who, please excuse me, in our current state of societal narcissism, almost require the amplification of white, cis-presenting male ally voices to even have the issue acknowledged as real before some will even pretend to listen. White saviors, you say? Well, sadly, that's kind of a dismissal of problematic toxicity, as much as the topic of performative wokeness. The fact is, we just don't know someone's true intent. So we have to rely on taking them at face value. That's when track records, who they are today, what they've done and said, and all those things come into play into whether that person is embraced as a safe and reliable ally of the cause, whatever that cause might be. It's also the same track record of seeing what someone truly thinks about guns to determine their fitness to wield one. Today, the LGBTQ plus communities, the Black community, the Indigenous, Asian, Latinx, all communities of color or mixed race, religion, etc., Jewish, Muslim, and other religions that aren't white nationalist evangelical King James Christians. And especially women. These groups aren't weak, but they aren't small. But the powers that be and the institutions in place are such that it's a straight white man's world in America. Yes, some of that is changing. And I'm not taking anything away from those voices who didn't need a white person to say it too. I'm not saying the only way change can be made is if white people say it. I'm saying when white people say it, the power is amplified exponentially in the attentions of those who are so broken that they require that warped sense of validity, verification, or endorsement, consciously or subconsciously. And today, those groups are so looked down upon, dehumanized, denigrated, disregarded, and dismissed that the people who treat them as such and those who enable them to do so rely on the fact that you won't care because deep down you agree with them. If you didn't, you'd speak out. And when you do speak out, you're humiliated as trying to step on that group's toes or be some fill-in-the-blank, whatever their argument is to take away the power of your voice. That's what they want. They don't want you to stand up as an ally. They don't want your voice to be a megaphone for their cause, for any cause, because then other white people will see white people saying that it isn't okay, and then those terrible people, the evil people, that will lose support when their well-groomed, indoctrinated, and brainwashed flock wake up from the spell they're under. No wonder they don't want us to be woke. If you were a proud gun owner, then you might just stand up as a gun owner, not with a gun, but stand up and let them know that the Second Amendment demands that if a citizen is going to express their right to bear arms, it comes with the obligation to stand against threats, foreign or domestic. Now, again, I'm not calling for any violence. I'm simply making a philosophical point based on the perspective of responsible gun owners. Like we all know. By their perspective, shouldn't they be obligated to take a stand against a hate group bullying anyone? A hate group that calls itself a church in order to slide under the constitutional protections afforded to religious groups in America, taking advantage of our system, exploiting our principles of liberty for the sake of their own indoctrination, grooming, and brainwashing agenda, to build an army that they will then use to enforce their way of life on others. Evil people in a cult who, by academically and philosophically accepted definitions of doctrine, is taking the Lord's name in vain. Blasphemy of the greatest degree. That evil is allowed to reign free in America, to exploit our First Amendment and exploit our Second Amendment to enforce that. To enforce, through legislation, the fairy tale feelings of their faith, establishing their interpretation of what they will declare as our national religion, to warp, molest, and manipulate, for the sake of their own twisted and dark agenda, our freedom of speech, freedom of press, freedom of assembly, and freedom to be heard by our own government when we feel oppressed. To put a finer point on it, they seek to diminish the rights and freedoms of others, their opposition specifically, of what they can say publicly, what the media can report, what can happen when we gather news and when we gather to peacefully protest, and where we peacefully protest, when, how, and to silence the minority voices in this country who have been silenced for far too long already. Get this right. White supremacists might be a mathematical minority in this country, but they are not a silent minority, nor should they be in any way a protected group, even if, and especially if, they hide behind a religion. Yet, they seek to blow the gates open for what they can say publicly, what their media can report without consequence, who, what, when, where, why, and how they can assemble to harass, bully, exploit, dox, and assault others, while creating a theocratic authoritarian regime built on fascist ideals to trim the fat, cull the herd, and show the world that America is the country that dropped the bomb and we will do it a fucking again. FAFO. You see that a lot on pro-gun people's profiles. It's a rhetoric that's alarming, almost as alarming as "don't tread on me." Fuck around and find out. FAFO. Step in my yard, by God, now. The ideals of responsible gun ownership shouldn't include bullying, shouldn't include treason, shouldn't include any reference of any kind to America's Confederacy, Nazi Germany, America's Dixiecrats, or America's insurrectionists, period. The utopia they wish to build is centered around some of the secession legislation I've discussed before and the right's push for an Article 5 Convention of States. Every agenda they push forth publicly or otherwise is built on this end goal, and they're using the church as the shield, patriotism as the club, and they've sheathed their sword for the sake of their assault rifles. They're going to build this fascist utopia. Think of it like a modern-day barrel oak. And they're going to do it by doing the same thing they did to our First Amendment, to our Second Amendment. They've been at it since 1977. Before that, marksmanship was a skill Americans have always taken pride in. Through hunting, target practice, war movies, and the propaganda around them. Americans in the early 20th century took pride in their guns. Revolvers, rifles, shotguns, with varying ranges of makes and models and calibers, but there was a sense in early America that with these tools of defense, one could adequately protect their family and, if they needed, could hunt to provide for and serve their family. The idea of guns specifically, and the Andy Griffith Show, is a stronger point probably than even the comparison in how we view law enforcement in America. If we're being honest, America went from Andy to Barney, where the guns were locked up and for emergency purposes only, to where we wear one on our hip like a cowboy and pat it when we want to make a point. How did that happen? How did the cartoon caricature, the thing we all laughed at, become the accepted norm? Cartoons are funny to laugh at. Caricatures are amplified exaggerations of real features. Those who were Barney didn't like being the butt of all the jokes. Now, my argument is that Barney Fife might have been problematic as a police officer, but in real life, embracing that love of guns, the need for guns in every situation, and the use of that gun as a bully tool is sociopathic. We laugh at it for entertainment purposes only, but when face to face with that look in someone's eye when they're passionately expressing their feelings about machines that are for the sole purpose of killing, it gets a little scarier. How did people turn over their foundational moral values so easy? Fear, scare tactics, white supremacy, and nationalism. During the Civil War, Union soldiers were dying at alarming rates. Why? The South had prepared man, woman, and child for secession for decades. The idea of splitting over slavery wasn't something that just happened. This was a tug of war, pun intended, for many years. Fighting over which states could have and wouldn't have slaves, fighting among those states, infighting among families. It was volatile for much of the 19th century. So one might argue that in those more rural South areas, those might be better trained on firearms, since they not only had to keep the slaves at bay, but hunting, whatnot, people or otherwise, was a skill that was more culturally embraced, especially in those rural areas. Maybe. Either way, the National Rifle Association formed after the Civil War, having seen the Union losses and attributing some of that to poor marksmanship. The Confederacy were the rebels, for sure. Okay? And often they were being fired at quite poorly by the Union, who had the aiming acumen akin to stormtroopers. But this wasn't just a witty pop culture comparison. This was a real issue Americans faced. If we were that poorly trained to defend our own nation from traitors, how would we fare against smart people who were also sadistic murderers? How would we defend ourselves against a foreign invasion? The NRA formed in 1871 as an organization to promote marksmanship and safety with firearms. As I've discussed, politically, the nation was torn in the mid-19th century into the 20th century. But during that 100 years, white conservatives felt especially oppressed ideologically. By the mid-20th century, this was especially true. Their way of life was being threatened. Of course, smart people know that way of life was rooted in white supremacy, but the white supremacists didn't quite realize that. So from their perspective, they hadn't held the White House in over 2 decades, and when they did before that, they drove America to ruin. The ruin Democrats saved us all from with their darn New Deal democratic socialism. It made those people even more mad when they ousted Henry A. Wallace from the FDR deathbed ticket in favor of the racist bastard Harry S. Truman, and Truman dropped the bomb like they wanted, sure, but he also continued a lot of that New Deal policy. Then they got even angrier when they finally won the White House with a war hero who, as it turned out, was not all that conservative and might have even run as a Democrat, except that he was just a hair on the right side more. He rolled the dice that America would vote for a war hero and a change after so long with one party at the top. During Eisenhower, Republicans and conservatives, even many moderates, were disenfranchised at the willingness Ike showed to work with Democrats. The Democrats had wins for decades. It was the Republicans' turn now, and Ike was giving it all the way to the left. That's how Barry Goldwater spun it anyway. Rather than praising the unity and the willingness to compromise, come together for the greater good of the ideology of division, the anti-federalists, the Confederates, the Dixiecrats-to-be didn't want to win together. They wanted to win, and win on their ideas and nothing else. My way or the highway. Bulwarism before Bulware was Bulware. Burn the house down if they couldn't be the head of the household. That's the story of the Republicans in the 20th century, in a nutshell. That's important because it's that political movement that bred the Dixiecrats, that pushed for the political lobbying groups you've never heard of, and some maybe you have, to respond to any and all progress with more money than we could ever fathom. Following the 1972 Roe v. Wade decision, groups formed in Washington using dark money to plot to unwind that decision, which ultimately worked. That change took decades, but that's the long game of fascism. The gun issue has also been a decades-long reformation of the American personality. Just as America's dual philosophy on law enforcement, August Vollmer's training, psychology, and science-based approach to J. Edgar Hoover's heavy-handed hardcore my way or the highway mentality, Andy versus Barney, That same parallel runs with the pre-1970s NRA and the modern NRA. Over the course of the mid-20th century, as those white supremacists who had opposed desegregation, integration, civil rights, and had cheered or made jokes when men like Martin Luther King Jr. were assassinated, were openly brandishing their guns, maybe not as much as today, but certainly in smaller fashions. Those protests, both sides, were getting scarier and scarier. It had become clear that America was growing beyond anything our founding fathers could have ever imagined. What those people also realized was the idea of the Second Amendment wasn't intended to create a society where every single citizen is armed to the nines and ready for war games. The origins, as I've covered, were rooted in running the indigenous off their land and keeping the workers on their land. America's Second Amendment was about slave patrols just as much as the idea that we might have to defend our land from other white people invading. But when the white people in our land become the problem, something has to be done. So the NRA would lobby for common sense gun laws, ensuring that just anybody couldn't go out and buy a bunch of guns for whatever, without any questions. Some people, who I can only imagine intended very bad things, thought that was an atrocity and fought against it. Your Goldwater conservatives, who had devolved to show their true colors as Dixiecrats. Those sociopathic narcissists whose only consideration is their own idea of everything. The two men who overthrew the NRA were Harlan Carter and Neil Knox. Harlan Carter was a former cop and not the August Vollmer brand. Neil Knox was a gun activist and writer. Knox was known to those who knew him as someone who advocated for the kind of environment we see today, provoking fear and concerns in his work that talked about the Second Amendment being threatened, and that the answer was more guns to protect against the guns, more or less. While the NRA's core mission was education, information, and sensible legislation, these men felt the group abandoned its commitment to protecting the Second Amendment. For a few years, the National Rifle Association would experience this internal battle. This group, which was a business essentially, fell into a hostile internal coup, a corporate insurrection, if you will. The former cop, Carter, was appointed, that they say elected, as the executive director. His leadership marked a turning point for the NRA's membership and messaging. Carter was a staunch supporter of his interpretation of the Second Amendment, although not a constitutional scholar at all, only a cop. He was given the reins to the most influential gun organization in the world. Knox and Carter, now in total power, launched the Institute for Legislative Action, which, as I've covered before, changed the game of influence peddling in Washington. Within years, America's personality and accepted norms where guns were concerned was shifting away from marksmanship training, common sense advocacy, and safety education to membership drives, pro-gun propaganda, gun shows, and media misinformation campaigns designed to scare the living hell out of white people, enough to go buy more and more and more and more guns. Of course, to do that, the NRA had to have some help from the Supreme Court to sort of redefine what our rights were and meant. Then dismantling the restrictions and protections that kept you from being able to just go to Walmart and buy a rifle. The issue, of course, as I've covered before, is that the National Rifle Association doesn't just fund gun movements and gun groups in America. They fund propaganda campaigns across the globe, thanks largely to dark money, a lot of that Russian. They do this because the NRA, with their new influence and power, have made it so that politicians don't have to divulge when the NRA gives them lots of money. It's not just Australia, Canada, and the UK. It's countries where guns are banned. It's countries like Russia. Alexander Torshin and Maria Butina, the Russian oligarch, politician, former Russian senator, big donor to the NRA, and the handler of the convicted Russian spy, Maria Butina, that is. For an ideology that frowns upon globalism, when it comes to making a profit or pushing their agenda, globalism is of no concern to them. When they find out the NRA is funding propaganda campaigns in other countries, countries we may or may not have fought against to even be a country, when they find out corrupt elites from one of our longest-held archenemy nations is funneling money through them, NRA members dismiss it as fake news. Why? Because the long-lasting brainwashing of the masses that their right to bear arms may get taken away if their opposition ever gets in power, a lie the left just isn't willing to tell to get votes. What they fail to recognize is the nuance that the gun control often pushed for by the left is to keep sociopaths and the mentally unfit away from guns. Those arguing against that clearly are sociopaths who are mentally unfit to be anywhere near a firearm. After all, what kind of person, ... wouldn't want us to protect our community from those who are most likely to be a danger to that community? Notice how none of this episode was really about school shootings or mass shootings at all. That is a deliberate omission. I believe these events speak for themselves loudly enough. And if I'm being honest, the discussion on mass shootings and mass tragedy events related to guns could be its own separate episode, if not its own separate podcast. In fact, what I will say on the subject to close out is that if the National Rifle Association of old were around, they'd have been fighting for stronger gun laws, tighter restrictions and regulations, longer waiting periods, and to ban certain guns from the commercial market altogether. Following Columbine, the NRA of old would have spent their very, very deep coffers on change. After each and every major gun tragedy event, the NRA of old would have responded with a plan of action to ensure we create a society where those events don't happen as often or as easily. In fact, if the NRA was the NRA before 1977, our society wouldn't have had nearly as many of those events as often or as easily. Because that's the thing about America and our guns. We aren't willing to do anything that will ensure the problem goes away. In fact, we're convinced there is no way to get the problem to go away, so we feel un-American if we even think about a society without guns or that doesn't embrace guns, because if we don't brandish our guns, our enemies won't know that if they fuck around, they'll find out. What in red, white, and blue means is blood. Just like the little brown wiener dog rotting in a hefty bag in the woods of Rockwood, Tennessee. America isn't willing to make the hard calls to save lives where guns are concerned. America isn't even willing to have the discussion. The only discussion America is willing to have is how can we maybe reduce the number of gun deaths per year. But their only answer to that is manufacturing more and selling more guns to more people. Yeehaw! All hail the cowboy state. Doo-doo-doo-doo. Papa. Coming up, I'm delving into the history books for a story you may never have heard of. During America's Civil War, the lines of loyalty were not as clearly defined as that Mason-Dixon line. In fact, one particular area, in East Tennessee no less, refused to join the Confederacy, opposing the idea of slavery. There was a lot more to it, and I'll get into that next episode. I don't want to simplify it on just that one issue. But in the next episode, pardon me if you will, Viva Y'all's Resistance, you'll find out about the sovereign state of Franklin, America's own little progressive hub amidst Confederate white supremacy. It's easy to feel like the South, the entire South, was bad, especially as I'm deconstructing toxic white Southern culture in this show. But I want to highlight that there's more nuance than we often remember. Not everyone in the Union was an abolitionist, but even the abolitionists were split back then. Many didn't support the idea of slavery. Many simply wanted to crush the South's economy. Many felt like Africans shouldn't be forced into leaving their native homeland for servitude to their aristocratic masters. Many also felt like those Africans should have gone home once they were freed. Many in the South opposed slavery and the atrocities that came with it. We haven't changed all that much socially, culturally even, but in the next episode, we'll talk about this little blue dot in that sea of Trader Red in Northeast Tennessee, in the northeast corner, in the land of my alma mater, where there's a main highway named State of Franklin. In East Tennessee, we honor those who stood against the treasonous Confederacy, and we honor those who fought against their own, American against American, shedding blood of their brothers for conquest and control. Not all these men were heroes. This is a complicated history of America's lost state and how that failed experiment only lasted a few years. But the ideals and lessons learned of that would-be free Republic of Franklin would resonate, echoing for generations. And coming up, I'll tell you more about America's seditious split. The sovereign state of Franklin, the territory that was ceded and then they seceded before secession was trendy. And why this is a history lesson America can learn from as we teeter toward another period of division. As I'm deconstructing a culture of cultism. Thanks for joining me. My books, Overthinking Everything About You, the Compassion and Critical Thinking Workbook, and Influence, Overthinking Everything About Social Media, are available on Amazon, and you can link through them up to my website, joshbrandonmedia.com, where you'll also find my original music and links to other articles and stuff I've been in. You can check out my YouTube with playlists created for you to check out my previous voiceover work, my acting work, and all my TikToks and social media created content. You can check out my merch store as well on my website. There's Sir Talks a Lot, Swags a Lot store, where you'll find some cool t-shirts, trigger tees, and bumper stickers. Follow me everywhere online. Like, share, and subscribe to this channel. Do all the things I need you to do to help me grow. And if you like this series enough, consider a donation to Cash App, or better still, purchase one of my books. Don't forget to sign up for my email list. I'm Josh Brandon, and I'm overthinking everything.